Hi, welcome back. This is Andrew Sears again, and the next session I'm going to be talking about unbundling, rebundling, and strategies in higher education. So I'm going to start and just give a little bit of review of disruptive innovation theory, part of what we didn't really cover before, but Clayton Christensen, one of the things he talks a lot about, so this is the standard curve I showed you before on disruptive innovation, but I've added another curve, and the curve that he typically shows is the curve that's using modular architecture. And the idea of modular architecture, it could be, think of Lego bricks, you can just connect them anywhere. Whereas interdependent architecture, you can't move from one thing to the other. And there's a long history around architectures where interdependent architecture is a way to get things done really quickly. But modular architecture in the long term often has the highest performance. So one example of this was the Apple computer versus the PC computer. IBM had a modular architecture. Apple had a interconnected architecture. Another example, even now that's being repeated again to a certain extent, is the Apple's iPhone. So the Apple's iPhone was much better than Android. But right now Android has the largest market share, and its performance may not have reached the iPhone, and it remains to be seen whether it'll do that, but that's the overall trend that happens in market after market. So part of the reason why that's important, there's multiple reasons why all this is important, but one is that modularity allows for this increased innovation. The other is allows for another thing that's called unbundling. So the basic idea behind unbundling is, if you look at the old computer industry, it used to be that each computer company was vertically integrated, and they provided the chips, the computer, the operating system, the application software, and the sales and distribution. So IBM had their own, DEC did, Wang. But then it transitioned to being an unbundled computer industry where it was more horizontal, and there you had the chips were manufactured by Intel, the computer where you had Dell and Compaq and Hewlett Packard. Microsoft dominated the operating system. Then you had application software, and you had distribution in a lot of different channels. So there's a lot of markets where unbundlings happen. So Netflix is unbundling cable television, iTunes unbundled albums, where you had to buy all the songs on an album. Now you can just buy individual songs. Online news is unbundling newspapers. So unbundling is one of the major factors in disruptive innovation. So anyway, one of the papers that I read on disruptive innovation and unbundling that was most helpful is by a guy by the name of Michael Stanton. And what he did is he really broke up the components of a traditional degree into 4 categories. And he called them knowledge acquisition, access to opportunities, cognitive and employable skills, and personal transformation. Now, I added in later just the idea, if those of you who are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, some of these areas really correlate with some of the larger domains of Bloom's taxonomy. So knowledge acquisitions largely in the cognitive domain, personal transformations largely in the affective domain, and then a lot of some of the cognitive and employable skills, particularly the facilitated practices in the psychomotor domain, and then the models and thinking of doing is in the metacognition. So what he argued is, he said that those items in the darker blue are going to be easiest to disrupt, whereas the things that are in the lighter blue are going to be harder to disrupt. So the idea is that knowledge acquisition, content is being commoditized. MOOCs are one example of that, but a lot of the content is being commoditized. Now, he's arguing that access to opportunities is easy to disrupt. Now, there's some ways that's probably true, and I think he's probably looking at code academies and some examples along those lines where you're guaranteed a job at the end. But there's other aspects like providing degrees that I think will be more difficult. And then on the cognitive and employable skills, that becomes harder to disrupt because you need more of the mentoring, and involves people, and the personal transformation. he's saying is the hardest to disrupt. So I'm going to use that as a basic framework of talking about how the university can be unbundled. So if you take the idea that each of those 4 domains, knowledge acquisition, access to opportunity, metacognition, and skills, and transformative experience, could be broken up and could be modularized just like the PC industry is, then you can start to understand what's actually happening. Now, the way this works in the world that we're moving towards is universities can still provide all these components, but there's going to be other competitors. So universities are competing with open education. I talked with a friend who is going to Harvard, and he said, you know, I think it's funny that I'm going to Harvard. I skip half my lectures, but I'm learning all these concepts using Khan Academy. So the Harvard professors are competing with open education and Khan Academy. Then you have MOOCs and apps. So, you know, I think that MOOCs are interesting, and I think that they are unbundling part of the content equation, but I think for the most part, MOOCs, and MOOC stands for Massively Open Online Courses, I think for the most part, they are just a content component. So in many ways, they're like a multimedia book. And until they're rebundled, I think that they're not that valuable. Then there's also a lot of vendors out there that do paid courseware. There's different platforms out there. Pearson has one, McGraw-Hill has one, where you can basically buy prepackaged courses. Learn Smart, I think, is one of them, and Smart Books, I can't remember the other ones. Then you also have ways that things are getting unbundled through competency-based education, prior learning, testing out of exams. So that's another example. Then you might have community college that's providing, you know, different components. So they might offer just one course. And then a big new player is these alternative education providers like Straighterline and Sailor Academy. So the idea is each of these things now is competing with the university to provide unbundled credits, or unbundled just knowledge. Now, you need to rebundle that somehow to actually give credits, and that's part of the key to the access to opportunity. So you have the university there, then you also have industry certifications, and a lot in the tech industry, this is really big, where you can get A+ certification, you can get Microsoft certification, Cisco certification. Then there's boot camps and accelerators where they'll guarantee a job at the end. Then I think increasingly you're going to see staffing agencies get into this business. You're going to see companies that are wanting to have an end-to-end solution. They're going to be acquiring staffing agencies. You're going to see employer networks that are out there, and alternative credentials like badging and certificates that people are offering, where on Coursera you can get a certificate, or on edX you can get certificates. So those things are being unbundled. Then you also have the metacognition and skills, and there's some things that play at both levels. So boot camps and accelerators, they're providing access to opportunities through employer relationships, but they are also providing the mentoring that you need to provide hard skills for coding. And then you also have vocational and trade schools that may not be accredited. You have internships and externships, and you have just students doing independent projects that they're managing in e-portfolios and things along those lines. And then the transformative experience. So the university, you know, they are the strongest there, but I think increasingly students are looking for transformative experiences that they're adding on to the university. There's a concept of a gap year between either high school and college, or right after college, where you go, you know, explore the world or do some service. So service learning, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, you know, spending a year in service is a transformative experience. Study abroad is a transformative experience. And religious service, you know, there's a lot of you know, people who will do a year of missions that's a part of a transformative experience. So I think increasingly what you're going to see now, unbundling any one of these components by itself isn't that useful, just like a microprocessor by itself isn't useful. But whenever you rebundle it, that's whenever it becomes much more useful. So what I'm going to go into in the next part is I'm going to talk about some of the ways that these components are being rebundled into different business models. So one of the other key aspects is that unbundling typically shifts producer surplus which is university profits, to consumer surplus, which is student benefit. So, I don't pay Netflix very much, but I cut my cable, and I get a lot of benefit from Netflix. So that's just one example. Same thing with iTunes, and you hear the record industry, complaining about their trading, dollars from CDs to pennies from iTunes and from the subscription services. So the first rebundling example I want to talk about is Western Governors, because they're one of the best known. So you take the different components, and what Western Governors is doing is they're taking paid courseware. They went out and they said, we don't want to create anything that we have to. And they're also combining that with credit by exam or competency evaluation. So if you've already learned something, then you don't have to relearn it. So they're taking that, and then they're doing access to opportunity. So one thing they're doing is they're bundling all that in a degree, and most of these bundles are going to be bundling a degree. And with that, they're bundling with that degree, credit by exam, the prior learning, so they're certifying that in the degree. Then they're also documenting competencies and industry certifications. So many times you'll get a degree with Western Governors, but you might also get a tech certification like Microsoft certification, but you'll also have competencies that are aligned with what employers are expecting. And then what they've done is they've broken up a lot of the metacognition and the skills components into different components of the faculty that I'll talk about later on how they're unbundling faculty. So there you have the course mentors, which is a subject matter expert, which for each of their courses, you can ask for help from someone who understands that topic. But the student mentors in Western Governors model travel with the student between courses. So if someone takes a 2-year program, the student mentor will stay with them, and they'll meet with them, weekly or bi-weekly. And then they've also separated out the evaluators, so that the people who are doing the grading, doing the assessment, are different from the people who are providing the suggestions. And then they have program faculty, and that really is kind of a replacement for a department head. And they also will integrate a lot of practical experience. Now, one of the themes you're going to see in these rebundling examples is that many of these rebundling examples are going after the non-traditional student. And many of the non-traditional students really aren't looking for the transformative experience. They may be in their 30s or 40s, and they're not looking for this rite of passage into adulthood. So they don't have any offering there. Next example is LinkedIn. And LinkedIn, out of all the examples, I think in the long term, it's them and other examples like this that I think is going to be the biggest thing for colleges to worry about. Western Governors is very significant, and the competency-based education model is very significant. But I think this model is going to be the most significant. So what they've done, LinkedIn acquired lynda.com. Lynda.com is a website that has the best videos training you in just about any topic that you would want. And what they can do is they can combine, and all of a sudden they can develop this competency profile that you have, and they can say, to get this job you need to have these 3 things. Why don't you take that with lynda.com, and on top of that we'll certify that. And they can also link with industry certifications. They can add in information from universities into it, and they're providing this competency profile. So today employers go to universities because they have the best signal for markets, so that they're just looking for people who can get the job done. But in the long term, there's going to be these employer analytics that LinkedIn is going to provide to employers, and they can look through detailed competency profiles. And there's even groups that are talking about what if you could show every have analytics on every exam that the person's taken all the way through college, so you'd know not only the high level, what grades they got, but you could tell how did they do on this particular type of programming assignment. Now there's privacy issues with that, but there could be some opportunities with that. And the other thing, I wouldn't be surprised to see LinkedIn get into the business of testing services and acquire someone like EDS or something along those lines, so that they can demonstrate and provide stronger signals to employers. And then the last thing, I think LinkedIn, I wouldn't be surprised also if they get into something along the lines, they're not going to major in metacognition and skills, but I wouldn't be surprised if they get into job placement services and coaching. So that's another example. A third rebundling example is code academies. So code academies will take people, usually they're very high IQ people, highly intelligent, but they are in they might have gotten in a degree where they can't get a job, and they'll retrain them in 6 months and guarantee a job, or close to guarantee a job. So what they're doing on the knowledge acquisition is they're taking the most current, highest demand content from top practitioners, and then they have really strong relationships with employers. They have a strong brand that employers trust, and their brand really is about recruiting raw brain power. So a lot of what these tech companies want is they want someone who has an IQ of 140, who's a genius, who has some tech programming. And then they're providing mentored project-based learning. So people are doing the programming for months at a time. They're doing it really intensively. And that becomes another competition. And then the last example is the area of vocational qualifications. So on the area of vocational qualifications, you have, and this is really what happens in the UK system of education, in Europe, EQF and RQF, and really in most of the world for vocational education, they really have a two-tiered system where the freshman year is called level 3, sophomores level 4, juniors level 5, and then typically what you do is you'll take your level 3 through 5, and if you really want to get the highest access to opportunity, you're going to get a bachelor's degree through a top-up, what's called a top-up bachelor's degree. And same thing you can do with level 7. You can get a level 7, and that provides part of the components you need for a master's degree, or a level 8 that'll provide part of the components that you need for a doctorate degree. So often what you can do is you can take a rebundled program with vocational qualifications where you can get levels 3, 4, and 5 at ultra low cost, these vocational learning centers, and then you do a top-up degree for those. So the metacognition and skills are at these vocational learning centers, and in a lot of countries there will just be thousands of these centers that are not very regulated. The regulation happens through the exams that is being provided through the vocational qualifications, and it's a very entrepreneurial market. And then you also have internships and externships, and you have people who are actually working on the job. And again, there's no offering on the transformational experience. So the last thing I want to talk about is, if you're looking at unbundling and outsourcing, so what sort of strategy do you use? Now again, this is not a disruptive approach. This is more an incremental approach. But one thing you can do is, if you say, freshman, sophomore year, they're getting commoditized, you can start to move higher up in Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy talks about, the higher levels of learning, and the analyzing, evaluating, creating. You move into more junior year content, senior year content. You might outsource freshman and sophomore content, and that's what a lot of schools are doing whenever they partner with Straighter Line or partner with community colleges. And then you move more into graduate education also. So, that's essentially the summary, is that it's being commoditized at the bottom. What you try to do is you try to accelerate that education with automation, I think, is a key part of that. And then you move up to the core competency, and your strategy really is to double down. And ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to race with the machine, not against the machine. So there's some stuff that's just going to be commoditized. You can try to fight that, but ultimately it's going to be like saying, I'm going to be a farmer that is just going to use my horses, or just use, push my plow in the face of, automation. And I think that's going to be, a losing proposition. Now, the last thing is just talking about, Bloom's taxonomy and the types of assessments. Some assessments are very objective. Other assessments are subjective. So if you're going to look at, what's going to be commoditized, what's going to be automated, it's going to be the things that are at the lower levels of Bloom's, have the most objective assessments. So the things that the highest level of Bloom's taxonomy and the most subjective assessments are going to be the hardest to automate. So with that, look at the links that I have and provide comments as usual. Thanks a lot.